you made the most important decision of your life before you knew how to speak, before you took your first step, before you knew what a decision even was. And that one decision still controls how you trust, how you love, how you handle fear, and how you connect with the world. Psychologists say we pass through 8 defining battles in our lives, 8 invisible tests that shape who we become. And the first one happens the moment we enter this world. Can I trust it? That question is not asked with words. It's asked with a cry, a breath, a searching glance. You were born reaching, hoping something, someone would reach back. Some of us were met with arms, with warmth, with consistency. Others were met with silence. In the 1980s, Romanian orphanages were overcrowded. Cribs lined the walls, dozens of infants lying still. Not because they were peaceful, but because they had already learned no one was coming. The researchers said it was the quiet that haunted them most. Babies who didn't cry, because crying requires hope. And these children had run out. When care is inconsistent, when needs are met with coldness or absence, the brain adapts. It learns that the world is unpredictable, that closeness isn't safe, that you're on your own. And then those patterns settle in, into your friendships, into your relationships, into how you show up for others, and how you expect them to show up for you. Maybe you find yourself doubting people for no reason, or panicking when someone pulls away, or trusting too fast, then regretting it, or refusing help, even when you need it. That's not weakness. That's your nervous system echoing its first lesson. But it isn't permanent. Because even if no one came before, you can show up for yourself now. Even if the world once told you to close off, you can begin again. You see, this first stage of life, trust versus mistrust, isn't about perfection. It's about possibility. The possibility of believing that the world, while chaotic, can still offer connection. That someone, somewhere, might still meet you halfway. If you're watching this, it means something in you still believes that's true. Even a little. And that's enough. Because trust doesn't mean letting everyone in. It means knowing that when the time comes, you can let someone in. It means believing that you'll survive the risk of connection, even if you've been hurt before. So if you were held, if someone came when you cried, if you were loved, hold that close. That's your foundation. And if you weren't, your task is harder, but more heroic. You have to build that trust, brick by brick. You have to answer the question yourself. Is this world safe? And you have to be willing to believe that, yes, sometimes it can be. Because until that question is answered, every other question about love, about confidence, about belonging, will echo that uncertainty. And life doesn't wait. The second question comes fast. It's not about safety. It's about something even more vulnerable. Can you stand on your own? Are you allowed to move through the world in your own way, without shame? That's where we go next. But before we do, ask yourself, did the world feel safe when you arrived? And if it didn't, what would it mean to begin rewriting that story, starting now? There's a moment in early childhood that most people forget. Not because it wasn't important, but because it was the beginning of something so subtle. We didn't know we were being shaped by it. It's the moment you start to move on your own, reach on your own, insist on doing things your way. And the world responds. If you were encouraged, you grew. If you were scolded, you shrank. If you were ignored, you learned to doubt. That's what the second stage of life is really about. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. But it's not just about walking or potty training or choosing your clothes. It's about whether the people around you gave you permission to exist as a separate person. A person with agency. A person who could make decisions, even messy ones. Most toddlers say no, not because they're defiant, but because they're discovering the boundary between themselves and everyone else. It's not rebellion, it's selfhood. And the way the world handles that selfhood becomes the script that runs in the background of your entire life. Were you allowed to explore? Were you allowed to make mistakes? Or were you taught that failure equals embarrassment? Because when a child is constantly corrected, scolded or shamed for trying, they don't just stop the behavior. They stop believing in themselves. They don't learn that mistakes can be fixed. They learn that mistakes make them bad. And that shame calcifies. It shows up when you hesitate to speak in a meeting, when you apologize for things that aren't your fault, when you second guess your instincts, when you feel guilty for wanting something, even if it's small. That voice you hear, the one that says, don't bother, you'll mess it up, or you're too much. That's not your intuition, that's shame, installed long before you had the words to fight it. There was a girl, known only as Jeannie, who spent the first 13 years of her life locked in a single room. Her father believed she was better off isolated. She wasn't allowed to move, speak, or even look out a window. By the time she was discovered, she had no language, no motor skills, no autonomy. Her development had stopped completely. And though her story is extreme, the lesson is not. When a child is denied freedom, they don't grow. They survive. They adapt. They disappear. But here's the turning point. Autonomy is not about doing everything perfectly. It's about trying. It's about having the right to begin. And that right never expires. Which is why, even now, as an adult, every time you take a risk, every time you move toward something new, you're re-answering that childhood question. Am I allowed to be my own person? Every time you speak up, you reclaim that answer. Every time you make a decision, even a small one, you affirm your place in the world. And when that autonomy is met with support, something powerful happens. You stop holding your breath. You stop waiting for permission. You start initiating. You start creating. And that brings us to the next question life asks, the one we often silence before it's ever spoken. What happens when I act on my own desires? Is my initiative welcome? Or is it a problem? That question, more than almost any other, will decide whether you move through life with guilt or with purpose. As you grow, something subtle but profound changes. The world stops praising you for trying and starts expecting results. Suddenly, effort isn't enough. You need to finish, to win, to measure up. This is the stage of industry versus inferiority, and it hits quietly, often around the time you enter school, but it echoes through the rest of your life. Because here, for the first time, the question becomes, am I good at anything at all? At first, the answer seems straightforward. Grades, gold stars, applause. If you build something well, you're told you're smart. If you struggle, you're told to try harder. But underneath those surface lessons, deeper beliefs begin to form. Beliefs about your ability, your potential, your worth. There's a boy named Ishan, captured in a film not enough people have seen. He's 8, bright, curious, and lost. He can't spell, can't sit still, can't read the way others do. Teachers call him lazy, classmates mock him. His parents don't understand. And slowly, silently, he starts to disappear inside himself. But what no one sees is this. Ishan has dyslexia. His brain just processes language differently. But his creativity, his imagination, his ability to paint with colours no one else even sees, that's his genius. When one teacher finally recognizes it, the transformation is almost immediate. Not because Ishan suddenly becomes someone new, but because someone finally sees who he already was. That's the power of being recognized. But most of us didn't get that moment. We were measured by standards that didn't fit us, judged in classrooms that rewarded memorization over curiosity, labeled too slow, too emotional, too unfocused. And we internalize those labels as truth. You start telling yourself stories. I'm just not academic. I'm not creative. I'll never be good at this. But what you're really saying is, I wasn't safe to struggle. I wasn't allowed to learn in my own way. That's what inferiority sounds like. And it doesn't leave when school ends. It follows you into job interviews, into creative projects, into moments when you want to try, but hear a voice whisper, you. Don't even bother. But here's what that voice doesn't want you to remember. Industry is not about being the best. It's about being willing. Willing to show up, to build, to learn, to try again. Psychologist Carol Dweck calls it a growth mindset. The belief that ability is developed, not fixed. And when you believe that, failure becomes feedback, not a verdict. The problem isn't that you failed. The problem is that someone once made you believe failure meant you didn't belong. But you do. You always did. You don't have to be the fastest or the most gifted. You just have to keep showing up. And when you do, something shifts. That early shame begins to lift. That quiet belief, maybe I can do this, starts to grow. And what's more, you realize you don't need to do it alone, which sets up the next stage. Because once you've built the tools, the confidence, the work ethic, the next question comes crashing in. But who am I really? Not who they told you to be. Not who you pretended to be, but you. And the search for that answer changes everything. Adolescence doesn't start with a mood swing. It starts with a mirror, not the kind you hang on a wall, the kind that stares back at you in silence and asks, who are you? You're not a child anymore, but you're not sure you're an adult either. You're just becoming, and no one gives you a map. So you start trying on identities like clothes, changing styles, shifting beliefs, rewriting your personality to see what sticks. It's easy to laugh at that version of yourself later, the hair, the angst, the chaos. But what most people don't realize is that this wasn't vanity, it was survival. Because the stage of identity versus role confusion isn't about fashion or rebellion. It's about fragmentation. You're handed roles from the moment you're born. Be the good one, the smart one, the strong one, the funny one, the caretaker, the achiever. And for a while those labels feel like anchors. But then they become chains. You start to wonder, what if the real me doesn't fit any of these roles? And that's terrifying. Because if you strip the labels away, who's left? David Reimer faced that question in a way most people can't imagine. After a tragic medical accident, doctors told his parents to raise him as a girl. They said identity was just nurture, that if he was dressed the part, taught the part, treated like a girl, he would become one. But David never felt right in that role. His body didn't match the expectations. His mind pushed against the identity imposed on him. At 14, the truth came out. David took his name back, his identity back, and finally, his life started to feel like his own. But the damage, years of confusion, disconnection, and denial, left scars. His story is extreme, but it echoes in a quieter way for the rest of us. We may not have been forced into an identity, but many of us were shaped into one, and we kept performing long after it stopped feeling true. You learn how to laugh at the right time. You learn what parts of yourself to mute. You figure out what makes people like you, and you amplify that, not because you're fake, but because you're terrified that the real you won't be enough. But eventually the mask starts to itch, and you ask the question directly, is there a me beneath all this? The answer isn't simple, it's forged in refusal. Refusing to perform, refusing to fit, refusing to hide. And what's left, what survives that burning away, is not always pretty. It's not polished. But it's yours. That's identity. Not a role you play, a self you protect. And once you have it, once you start to walk through the world as someone you recognize, the next question appears. Not just, who am I? But can I let someone else see me and stay me? Because knowing yourself is only the beginning. Letting someone into that self, that's the next battle. And it's the most vulnerable one yet. Once you begin to understand who you are, even in fragments, life doesn't let you stay there long. It hands you a new question. Can I share myself and still stay myself? That's the challenge of intimacy versus isolation. Not just romantically, but in any space where two selves try to meet without one vanishing into the other. Most people think intimacy is about closeness, but real intimacy doesn't start with nearness. It starts with risk, the risk of being known. Because once you've built your identity, tentative, fragile, but yours, the scariest thing you can do is hand it to someone else and say, this is me. Will you still choose me? And most of us aren't taught how to do that. We're taught how to attract, how to present, how to perform, but not how to be seen. So we create connections that are just close enough to feel safe, but never deep enough to feel real. We share pieces, not the whole. We trade vulnerability for validation. And over time, something empties out. You can be in a room full of people and still feel unknown. You can have a partner who loves the role you play, but not the parts you've never let out. And eventually the silence between who you are and who they think you are becomes deafening. This is where isolation begins, not in solitude, but in the presence of others who don't really see you. Because isolation isn't just being alone, it's being unknown. The truth is, most people fear intimacy more than loneliness. Loneliness is familiar. Intimacy requires surrender. It asks you to stop performing, to expose the parts of yourself you're not proud of, and to trust that you'll still be loved. And that's a terrifying gamble. But it's also where everything changes. Because intimacy, when it's real, doesn't just affirm who you are, it deepens it. It challenges you, softens you, strengthens you. It holds up a mirror and says, this is you, and I'm still here. And in that moment, something breaks and something heals. There's a line from C.S. Lewis that stays with you. To love at all is to be vulnerable. If you want your heart to remain intact, he says, lock it away. But if you want to be alive, truly alive, you must offer it up, bruises and all. That's the tension of this stage, because without intimacy, you survive, but with it, you you become. And this transformation isn't just about relationships. It bleeds into how you work, how you lead, how you parent, how you speak. Everything becomes more human when you stop hiding. But it comes at a cost. You have to be honest. You have to listen. You have to stay, even when it's uncomfortable. You have to let people in and let yourself out. And when you do, you create space, not just for connection, but for expansion. Because the next stage of life isn't about you anymore. It's about what you build with what you've become, what you give, what you leave behind. And that brings us to the next question. What will outlast you? There comes a time in every life when the spotlight shifts. It's no longer about who you are or what you can achieve. It's about what you're building for others, for the future, for something greater than your own name. This is the stage of generativity versus stagnation, and it asks a question most people avoid until it's too late. What am I creating that will still matter when I'm gone? For some, this question shows up as parenting. For others, it's mentoring, teaching, writing, building, planting, organizing, healing. Doesn't matter how you give. What matters is that you do. Because if you don't, if you focus only on yourself, your comfort, your advancement, something begins to wither. You can feel successful, respected, admired, and still feel useless. That's stagnation, the slow, sinking feeling that you're not growing anymore. And no one needs what you've become. But there's a way out, and it doesn't require reinvention, just intention. There's a story from India that almost sounds like a parable, but it's true. Dashrath Manji was a poor labourer. One day his wife was injured, but the nearest doctor was miles away across a mountain. With no road, no way through, she died before help could reach her. So Dashrath picked up a hammer and chisel and decided to carve a road through the mountain by hand. Everyone called him mad, laughed, moved on, but he kept going for 22 years, and in the end, the road was finished. 360 feet long, 30 feet wide, connecting his remote village to the world. He didn't do it for fame. He did it so no one else would suffer the way he did. That's generativity. Taking your pain and turning it into a path for someone else. And you don't have to carve through stone to do it. You just have to ask, where is the mountain in my life? And who am I building the road for? Because legacy isn't about greatness, it's about usefulness. It's the email you send that changes someone's day. The idea you plant that outgrows you. The kid who remembers what you said 15 years ago and lives differently because of it. And here's the truth most people miss. Generativity doesn't just serve others, it saves you. It gives meaning to the suffering you couldn't escape. It turns the middle of life from a crisis into a contribution. And it prepares you for the final question, the one you won't ask in your 20s or 30s, the one that comes when the building slows and the quiet gets louder. Was it enough? That question waits for all of us. And the answer has nothing to do with wealth or fame or perfection. It has to do with what you gave, who you became, and whether you can look back and say, that story, that was mine, and I'm proud of it. Because if you can say that, if even a whisper of it rings true, then the final chapter, it isn't an ending, it's a beginning. One that lives in the people you touched, the paths you cleared, the seeds you planted, and maybe that's all we ever needed.